7 minutes. For some reason, ICS isn't able to reset it. So I guess we should start. Can I ask how many? Okay, but I keep getting asked questions by the system. Okay, so all right, I think we should start because we've got 2 hours allocated, and folks from different parts of the world, hopefully different time zones, so we all have different scheduling. So let me please welcome delegates to both the, is anybody at the physical venue? I don't think so, or that they're all online. Okay, I'm in Cape Town. My name's Kian Tomaselli, and I hold the position of Distinguished Professor in the Faculty of Humanities at the University of Johannesburg, and I co-chair the Academy of Science of South Africa's Scholarly Publication Committee that deals both with the positive and negative effects of incentivization. So I found this book absolutely fascinating and central to the work that we are doing. And in being asked to chair this event, I cast my mind back to when I was a student at Wits in the late 1960s. And certainly in those days, no one talked about an incentivized university. The self-incentivized drew on the intrinsic benefits of symbolic recognition. Others created their own incentives of scoring an academic job and then concentrating on well-paying outside consultancies. And others simply like to exploit the leisure of reading at one's own pace. And many were simply costly passengers on the academic bus, which I guess is why incentivization comes into being in the first place, apart from the political economic reasons that Sean discusses in his book. So the need to be incentivized just to do our job seemed to me in those days to be rather curious. So Sean has explored that rather odd need in assessing what the university has become as a result. And we have 3 discussions today, and I will introduce each when invited to talk, and they each have 15 minutes following Sean's self-depreciating 10 minutes. But being an economist, I guess economy of words is also an issue. So Sean, over to you.
Great, thanks, Kian. Thanks so much for agreeing to chair, and thank you also for introducing yourself. I mean, the way we met was partly a result of concerns with these kinds of dynamics. So thanks very much for chairing. And in case I don't get a chance at the end, thanks so much for the 3 discussants, Peter, Ronald, and Nomalanga for agreeing to participate today. So yeah, I've got about 10 minutes. The intention is really to try and summarize the reasons for the book, the contents of the book, and some of the things that I think are particularly important in it. I'm not going to go into the full acknowledgements and so on. You can find those in the text itself. The book essentially arose out of concern with the dynamics of higher education systems, not just in South Africa, but globally. And in particular, what I saw is the disjuncture between the societal status that academics and universities and higher education institutions hold, the basis on which they hold that status, and how they in fact operate in practice. And that's not a new concern, of course. Many other people have had the same concern. But it occurred to me that in order to, and there are large literatures emerging on these, or that exist and are growing on these various issues, but it occurred to me that in some sense there are deeper theoretical issues here, particularly when it comes to the manner in which higher education systems and the conduct of academics are being directed, or people are trying to direct that kind of conduct, that links to an issue of directing intellectual inquiry via incentives. That's sort of how I came to frame the work that I subsequently did, and I found it productive to narrow that down to the question of thinking about scientific progress and the dynamics of scientific communities, and then incentives within that context. So there's a lot of discussion about sort of practicalities of different kinds of incentives. There's a discussion about the history of how higher education institutions and higher education systems came to be managed in this way, discussions of neoliberalism, managerialism, and so forth. But not much discussion of how that connects to deeper theoretical questions. And there are extensive literatures in philosophy of science on the issue of scientific progress, and also on the dynamics of scientific communities, the sociology of science and so forth. So the book, in some sense, tries to connect those two, the literature and those concerns with those concerns about the higher education system and those dynamics. So I draw a lot on Thomas Kuhn's work, thinking about scientific revolutions, the notion of normal science, and the implied or explicit dynamics of scientific communities. But there are many recent authors who deal with these kinds of things as well. A high-profile example is somebody like Philip Kitcher, who's written on science in a democratic society, thinking about what kinds of scientific inquiry should be happening, but also thinking about the dynamics of scientific communities and what kinds of characteristics lead to desirable outcomes. In the book, I tend to disagree with Kitcher on a number of issues, and when I say I draw on Kuhn, I do, but I don't necessarily come to the same kinds of conclusions as Kuhn did, either in his early work or in his subsequent work. So that's sort of where the book came from, and some of the approaches that I took. I just want to emphasize because of course, the readers will ultimately decide what they think is important in the book, and what is useful, as Kian was saying, in terms of actual work that is happening in higher education systems. And I do intend the book to serve both purposes. So there are many aspects of the book that I see as well, from my perspective, as being contributions to the academic literature, but also I do think that reconceptualizing these issues, or at least locating these specific policy questions within the context of these kinds of philosophical concerns, is actually practically very useful. So let me just say that the approach that the book takes from a sort of intellectual point of view is at its core, the sort of philosophy of science in the book is a fairly straightforward model of what would be called in the philosophy of literature scientific realism, and truth approximation. So I limit my discussion to the broad concept of science. I don't explicitly discuss literatures that couldn't be called science. But that includes social science. And the reason for that is because we can speak quite simply, I think, of the objectives of those disciplines, which is as some kind of truth approximation. And this certainly corresponds to what practitioners in those disciplines think they're doing, whether or not it corresponds to what some philosophers think they're doing. So I have this kind of fairly straightforward model of truth approximation, but an important aspect of that, and I think this will probably come up in some subsequent discussion, is an emphasis on domain-specific variation. And I use this notion of, I contrast what I call the epistemological horizon, which is essentially how long it takes for the methods and the data that we have available to kind of approximate truth in whatever domain we're talking about, whether it's physics or economics. And then what I call the ontological horizon, which is really the stability of truths over time. Okay. Now, this is a nice example because it sounds like very abstract and something that would be interesting to philosophers of science, but you think it wouldn't necessarily be so of interest to higher education policymakers. But in fact, later in the book, I come back to that sort of philosophical model, and I suggest that actually the implications of the kind of concerns I raise can vary quite substantially depending on what kind of domain we're talking about. So the issues that will arise in physics may well be quite different to the issues that will arise in economics, or at least the extent to which incentives can be harmful, things like incentives, the associated dynamics of academic communities, could vary quite a lot across different disciplines, different domains, and even different, shall we say, different geographical locations and hierarchies within the global academy. Okay, so I start out with that model, and then based on that model, I think about or I discuss the potential implications of dynamics within the scientific community, like those Kuhn described under the umbrella of what he called normal science. And I have some separate work now where I elaborate on this, essentially trying to characterize the literature on normal science and substantiating my view that basically normal science is actually quite prevalent and it's harmful, where somebody like Kuhn thought it was prevalent but actually not harmful. And so then you get into this within that philosophical model. You then think about dynamics of scientific communities, and at each point I take positions on these various issues, and based on those positions I then say, okay, if we were to try and direct these kinds of systems using incentives, what might some of the problems be? And some of the problems that arise are problems that are quite well known in the literature. So, for example, the concern that once you create an incentive for something, you distort the motive for doing it. And therefore, whatever empirical evidence you might have had to associate the particular variable that you use as an incentive and the outcome you want, you distort that by virtue of creating an incentive. So, that's one example, but there are various other ones that I discuss. And then having done that, I link that to these existing literatures and the sort of empirical and other discussion about the dynamics of modern higher education systems. And then say, okay, what can we learn about these approaches to modern higher education from thinking about these philosophical issues when it comes to the dynamics of scientific communities? And so that's sort of the, let's say, the second third of the book. And then the final third of the book, I think about, or I talk about how this varies across domains, as I alluded to earlier. And I use the example of economics to illustrate how I see some of the philosophical concerns. So I argue, for example, that the nature of the domains of inquiry that economics is concerned with is such that the epistemological horizon, so how long it would take us to identify truths, and our ability to do so is quite long. The ontological horizon is very short. And so, in fact, economics is not essentially well suited to being a science. I extend a notion that I take from another author called facsimile science, and I actually put an argument that economics and neoclassical economics, as it is often practiced, could be characterized as a facsimile science. And that's not a sidebar to the main study, because what I then argue is that that being the case, the use of incentives in that kind of context, the exacerbation of existing dynamics in that community is likely to make things worse rather than make them better. So again, it's an example that connects the base concerns in philosophy of science with the practical concerns. And in economics, of course, those practical concerns, we've just had an announcement of the Nobel Memorial Prize Award. Those practical implications have further implications because of the work economists do in terms of policy advice and influencing society. And by the time you get to, I think it's chapter 13, one might be quite pessimistic about the prospects of intellectual inquiry and whether we can whether higher education institutions and systems can operate in the way that we might want them to, but in the manner in which they purport to. And so, although I often push back against the notion that in the academic domain in particular, we should offer solutions to problems, I'm a big fan of identifying problems and stopping there, because I think the first thing in order to make progress is that we acknowledge problems in their nature. But nevertheless, I do make a little bit of effort towards the end of the book in the final chapter to discuss what I see as possible solutions. And in essence, the thrust of the argument is that instead of the current approach, which focuses on measuring impact, trying to incentivize particular kinds of approaches, using proxies for quality to reward academics and so on and so forth, is that rather societies, and of course within that policymakers and academics themselves, should rather focus on the norms of institutions and academic communities. So what you want to focus on, and I sort of use this in passing, but since we might have a larger South African audience, there's an organization called the Next Einstein Foundation, and they have a journal called Scientific African, and I'm at the moment one of the editors on that journal. And one of the rhetorical motivations for that organization is to find the African Einstein, the next African Einstein. And what I say in the book is that I don't think that's actually the right approach. I don't think a directed search for an African Einstein sitting in the equivalent of an African patent office is necessarily the right way to go about it. What you want is, you want academic institutions, and I use that in a broad sense, that will be receptive to such an individual's work, when they produce it, and not discriminate against them, for example, because of global hierarchies of knowledge, right? So the fact that they're in Africa, the fact that maybe they're outside academic institutions, but they're producing intellectually important work. So what we should focus on rather is the norms and the dynamics of these institutions, and getting them to operate as they purport to and as they should, because there's generally agreement on many of these kinds of things, rhetorical agreement, even if they're not represented in practice, rather than incentive-based direction of intellectual inquiry. So that's the thrust of the book, and my rhetorical flourish is to argue that scientific revolutions will not be incentivized. That's the rhetorical thrust at the end of the book. But thanks, Gian. That's my attempt at summarizing what I've tried to do and what I think is important.
Thank you, Sean. I think your message actually comes through loud and clear, that incentives have consequences in shaping questions and possibly even answers. Okay, so I'm now going to hand over to each of the three discussants. For those who came in a bit late, Sean has generously offered them more time than he gave himself, 15 minutes per presentation. And then we'll follow with some discussion and a wrap up. So the first discussant is Professor Naledi Bomalanga-Mkhize, who's Associate Professor of History at Nelson Mandela University and is a board member of the South African National Research Foundation and the Institute for Social and Economic Research at Rhodes University, amongst many other prestigious and no doubt influential positions. So let me please introduce Professor Mkhize to take the floor, or the screen in this case.
Okay. No, thanks. So you gave us 15 minutes. Is it because when we discuss these things, we have so much to rant about? Like, let me give my friends time. But congratulations, Sean, and well done on a very sophisticated analysis that goes over the head of a simple historian. And really trying to put theoretical, analytical structure to something that we all know is quite wrong, but needs for us to find a much more robust kind of language to deal with this thing. And so, you know, before, while you were talking, I just thought, let me update myself with the case of Professor Gregory Kwamwendo, because you and I and a few other young academics, I see Andrew here, but I don't remember, I think he may have signed. Remember, we wrote a letter to the Mail and Guardian when he was assassinated at University of Zululand. And we wrote this letter to try and honor this person who had died on behalf of academic standards and academic integrity. And that is a very disturbing thing. And what was more disturbing was that we were some of the few people that actually bothered to write publicly about this. And that bothered me, and it bothers me to this day. And we received, I received an email from a student of his who is now in Australia, who said, thank you guys for writing that important acknowledgement of this man. Because I experienced the same thing in another university where I was intimidated by syndicates, academic syndicates in the institution. So what we're talking about here is not a game. You know, in a resource-constrained environment like South Africa, it becomes a matter of life and death. This question of the university and its logics, especially around incentivization, and the culture that it breeds within, right? And so fortunately not fortunately, but at least some relief in the case of Professor Kwamwendo, his killers are behind bars, and the minister's statement implies that it had to do with academic fraud at the university. Now, all of us who are in universities, in the higher education sector, can attest to various gradations of various forms of this unintended consequence of a university or higher education sector that has come to basically follow consumer and market logics, where what matters is how much we're making for the institution or how much it's paying me, and all these market dynamics that suddenly enter into the realm of learning. Now, Sean, you remember I used to be on Twitter long ago in my youth. And in the very last moments of my being on Twitter, I had written an article called the Dirty Secret of Higher Education. And it basically, in a more public language, described this problem of what do incentives do to a system and how do they restructure the norms and the practices of learning, right? And effectively, people were upset with me because I was saying your graduations don't matter. They don't matter because we are incentivized to walk you across the stage no matter what. And if we don't walk you across the stage, we don't get paid. So we're going to have to find a way to make it possible for you to walk across the stage. And very many people didn't believe that. And I eventually decided, well, it was pointless to have a public discussion because one of the interesting things about the incentivized university is how it maintains its mythology as, an apex institution. And of course, interesting is the fact that one of the tricks of the animal is that it can contend with dissent, right? It's like Putin, he can contend with dissent. It's like the United States, they can have opposing views on one channel, but somehow, in spite of the ability, but somehow, even though there can be dissent, the animal can morph dissent into a disciplined, a disciplined behavior. You can be morphed by that system into a disciplined behavior because ultimately you're looking at your own performance agreement. You're looking at the performance management system that you're going to have to account to. You're looking at your own career and the fact that the standards keep sort of conforming to this new paradigm. So you become, in that Foucauldian way, your own disciplinarian. You must participate in your own kind of entanglement in the system, right? As we talk, I'm now a director. I have all these tasks now. And so we now have to negotiate with ourselves as to, okay, since I've now joined the power mechanisms of the system, how am I going to deal with these things, right? Am I going to be an enforcer of performance management? Then it becomes this individualized thing. So it's an interesting creature because we can sit here with, and UJ, UJ is very good at this, highly branded institution, highly corporatized. They're going to love the fact that you've produced your book because that's all that matters. The fact that you're critiquing the model, you're critiquing UJ, or I'm basically critiquing Nelson Mandela University as a corporatized kind of structure doesn't mean anything to them, just produce the output, right? So the creature is very, very crazy like that. So I thought, let me just put some points forward. You speak about pseudoscience in the book, and I want to kind of extend that. So this creature which can morph you into a part of itself and embed you in its own production systems and force you to conform with its disciplinarian mechanisms is a very interesting creature because, as you say, you end up doing what Paul Malem says, which is you produce, but you overproduce, and very few people are consuming or engaging. There's no capacity to engage in this kind of institution. And for various reasons. One, because everyone is overworked, because we're driven for output as they curtail the resourcing, right? So fewer resources, more output. And then secondly, there's a problem of the institution being very afraid of what its image looks like in the public and managing that together. So these dynamics lead to a kind of scholarship that it's almost as if it doesn't matter what you say, right? It doesn't really matter unless you offend the brand of the university or you are going to mess with its output capability. So when you talk about pseudoscience, I talk about pseudo-theory in the humanities, right? In the humanities, and I'm going to mention two pseudo-theories that have become popular in the humanities. One is the decolonization trend, right? Which, if you look, is a very generative space where people can talk and talk and talk about decolonizing Africa, produce books, and everybody gets applause, makes the universities look good, makes them feel like they're producing all kinds of things. And of course, nobody's really decolonizing anything. Everybody's still conformed to the power structure of the institutions. You're still working for a market principle, and you're still just vying for promotion with that, right? So that's the one pseudo theory that has become highly embedded. And that's linked, of course, to all this new sort of Black politics that you see that's spawned on social media, this Black politics of the United States, Black Lives Matter, and all the related kind of stuff, right? That looks at first as if, oh yeah, this is Black people talking, but as you look, especially at the scholarship, and you look deeper, what you just see is just a cynicism of output and output. I mean, so cynical that I've been arguing that the greatest scholars of decolonization are now white women. Okay, white women are busy teaching us how to decolonize as Black people because they've just decided, let's just position ourselves that way, it works for us, all right? The second pseudo-theory that we see emerging is this new iteration of intersectionality, which effectively takes what used to be a wonderful mechanism for describing the lives of Black women across the world and has really become a catch-all for anyone with a grievance, right? And the universities somehow, again, it seems like this radical proposition, right? We're here for queer, Black, femme, whatever, add all the things that you add into that. And it appears that this new university is, you know, it's liberalizing, it's opening up, it's diversifying, it's now acknowledging all this, you know, prior victimhood caused by whatever power structures, you know, that, you know, have existed in the world for the past 400 years. But if you look closely, you will again see there, in fact, in intersectionality, what you will see is an interesting thing. You'll see a kind of what I call a Euro-American liberal dogma that asserts itself as the primary theory by which we're going to understand human suffering, right? So it's not going to come from Nomalanga in South Africa, who has an experience of being an aunt and a mother. It's going to come from Judith Butler in the United States, and we're going to have to conform to Judith Butler, and we're going to have to mimic her theory in order to be considered, you know, ahead and progressive, and then all the iterations of that. And if you dare to move beyond that, basically your job is on the line. And I find all of this interesting, again, this animal that can create pockets of pseudo dissent. But of course, the whole thing, so there's output, it's output driven, and it wants to position itself and position you so you make it look good. And if what's going to make it look good this year is decolonization, at first you fight it, and then you go, man, absorb this thing. Next thing you know, it's the new slogan of every university and done very well. And it's embedded now in all the policies and all the systems. But of course, what hasn't changed? Where's your performance management? How are you producing? We're going to casualize our academic staff, you know, and all of that incentivization that goes with it. Of course, some of the stuff emerges, I'm looking at the time, Kayan, emerges from, okay, so I've said all of this, and I think we all know what I'm talking about. And, you know, I think everybody knows where I'm going with that, and we can discuss it further. But a lot of this is the foundation of it is strange. There are many currents, and I'm going to share briefly some thoughts of how we got to this point. How do we get to a point where something like decolonization, which should be a very radical and shaking theory just becomes a package for research outputs. One is that I think what we have seen is that the massification of the university sector across the world has forced universities to reckon with different kinds of populations, and we massify to survive, right? We massify to survive. You know, for white, your old white professor walks into their classroom and it's like, it's full of Nomalanga now, you know? And so the universities, so something happened, a demographic shift, working class, in a mass way that's not just white, okay, and not just elite. And suddenly you've got a new kind of demographic sensibility about the university that needs to survive by getting in large numbers of people. And by getting in these large numbers of people, you're asking them to pay fees. So in the past, and this is what my experience was at Rhodes, in the past, it used to be that the biggest complainer on campus is the rich white boy, because that's who the university was built for. But once we massified, I discovered that it doesn't matter who the person is. You are in trouble if you do not sort out the feelings or the problem or the marks or the assessment of whichever young person is around you, because that's the customer, right? So I think we all know that experience. And so in that context, I mean, one of my experiences is the hostility of Black parents. I mean, if you've experienced in the past, so if you've been in the system as long as I have, and you've experienced white South African parents, I mean, you just think, no, man, apartheid can't come back at my job. So that's how you deal with white South African parents, right? You just stand on it. You say, no, this is not going to happen. Just wait till you deal with Mamus Banban now, who wants their child to pass come hell or high water because they're paying school fees. And why is their child failing this module? You see, so these demographics create actually an interesting shared customer experience for our students. And then we become that element of the system that just has to comply all the time. And then I think one of the last elements that's one of the tricky things for us to understand is the transition from white, in South Africa specifically, from white control of universities into a post-apartheid democratic space. Now, in South Africa, what's basically happened is the very sort of aggressive white control of South African universities it's interesting, they wouldn't transform the universities through scholarly dialogue. They would rather fight you. So they fight you when you start trying to say, guys, there's more to South Africa. This isn't, South Africa is very parochial. They fight you, they fight Mamdani, they fight all these things. But they don't realize they're an aging professoriate. So they're fighting battles which are unnecessary. They leave the university and leave these fragmented pockets of the university. And how we've reorganized the fragmented pockets in South Africa is through corporatization. Because what you needed a power greater than the white professoriate. So the power that's greater than the white professoriate is the executive management. And so basically this is the curse of the former white professoriate's inability to let go of power properly. Because the only way to discipline them was to give the new leaders power to control them and to not override them in Senate. And we've seen this play out at UCT with this strange thing that's happening there. And you can see there's a strong, polarization between those who think the Senate should have the power and those who think the executive should have the power. But every single South African university has gone through this. So the aging white professoriate, in resisting logical, intellectual decolonization and engagement, forced the hand of a new management to use the new tools to control the situation, and unfairly. So I'll just put those things there, and hear from others. Thanks.
Wow. Okay. That was quite a presentation, and I think it grounds the broader theoretical discussion within the context that is South Africa. My screen has gone blank. Are people hearing me?
Yes.
Yes, am I being heard? Yes, okay, thank you. A wonderful, very engaging analysis that really gets to grips with the deeper issues facing South African academia that many of us have been writing about and perhaps not quite grasping in this extraordinarily analytical way. The death of Gregory Kamwendo, one of my colleagues at UKZN, certainly is cautioning and also, something that we needed to have needed to have exposed much more rigorously than occurred at the time. Okay, so let's move on to the second speaker. That's Peter Vickers, who is a professor of philosophy at Durham University and co-director of the Centre for Humanities Engaging Science and Society and leader of a Leverhulme-funded project entitled Exploring Uncertainty and Risk in Contemporary Astrobiology, and is also associate editor of the British Journal for the Philosophy of Science. And he also talks about in another book, Identifying Future-Proof Science. So I think that the order of the speakers seems to be taking its own organic path, and hopefully we can, at the end of this session, at least as Sean argues, ask the questions, identify the problems, if not actually solve them. So Peter Vickers, over to you.
Thank you very much, and thanks for having me here. It's a real pleasure to have the opportunity to read and discuss this book, and I found it a really stimulating read. And I'm going to especially focus on topics that come up in chapters 3, 4, 5, and 6. Here's the big overlap with my own work. So here's where I have more to say and more background knowledge. And the main focus is on this idea of consensus as tyranny. So there's a subtitle in one of the chapters, Consensus as Tyranny. And so I thought we could have a think about these broad ideas that come up in these chapters, that normal science is dangerous or can be dangerous, that there's a problem in scientific communities with suppression of ideas sometimes, especially revolutionary ideas. So what happens, broadly speaking, in the sort of Kuhnian way is that a paradigm forms or normal science takes root. And what that means is that there's a very strong feeling in the scientific community about the way in which science should be done, perhaps the methods that are reliable and the methods that aren't, the basic background assumptions which are true or factual or should be assumed, and such that alternative background assumptions are too unreasonable to take seriously, perhaps. Even what counts as evidence for an idea. So an idea might be put forward, but because of the contingencies of the normal science in place, the evidence supposedly supporting that idea is not taken to be the right kind of evidence, or even evidence at all. So an idea that's unorthodox, an idea that's going contrary to the paradigm, to the normal science practice, is not given a fair hearing, because what might be considered evidence for that unorthodox idea by some coming from a completely different perspective is not, given the paradigm that the community's in, is not considered good evidence. So we have this sort of situation where we tend to think of the ideas, or many of the ideas that we have now, as being true or approximately true, And then we think that normal science is good. So this is something Sean, puts forward very, very nicely with this contrast. He says, look, if we think the idea is true, then of course, alternative ideas should be perhaps inhibited because, well, they're wrong. But then we're encouraged to look at examples from history. There's the miasma theory of disease is one of Sean's favorite examples here in these chapters, where the normal science idea was actually false. And then, as Sean says, it gives him a chill down the spine. These normal science practices where, in this case, the right idea was inhibited. The germ theory of disease was inhibited or suppressed, or those favoring that theory were silenced. The worry is that this could happen again. And what we really want is a scientific community which is more open to what Sean calls revolutionary ideas. So there's a passage where he suggests that we should get rid of the suppression and marginalization of revolutionary ideas. Now, one of the interesting examples we could think about is Velikovsky's book, Worlds in Collision. This book that Velikovsky put forward in I think 1950, proposing an alternative view of the history of our own solar system. The scientific community of the day felt that this was complete hokum. And Velikovsky really didn't know much about the solar system and how it formed, and efforts were made to actually block the publication of Velikovsky's book on the grounds that this was a book that was completely uninformed of the scientific knowledge of the day. And this is one of those examples where it seems to suggest that suppression is basically okay, because the community were right. They did know a lot about how the scientific community, about how the solar system developed. And Velikovsky's ideas were completely without justification. And that's still the way we think now. The issue comes down to whether we think there can be such a thing as absolutely solid scientific knowledge. If you think there can be, and in this case, the community thought they had absolutely solid scientific knowledge about at least some features of how our solar system formed and came to be. It was on the basis of that feeling that really there was a lot that was known, if you like, known in capital letters, not just knowledge relative to a paradigm that may shift one day, but actually knowledge. It was on those grounds they thought it was justified to attempt to silence Velikovsky, to say that these ideas aren't worthwhile and this shouldn't be published as an alternative theory of the solar system. So if you like, Velikovsky thought he had revolutionary ideas, and Sean sort of worries about the marginalization or suppression of revolutionary ideas. And in this case, it seems, well, some would say it was okay to marginalize those ideas because we really did know that those ideas were wrong. Maybe we can think of lots of examples like this. The ultimate question here is whether it is ever okay to really sort of silence those who would try to have a platform, try to have a voice in science. And the suggestion in the book is that we need to be much more open to a range of ideas in the sort of Feyerabенdian way. You know, let everybody have a say. If their view really isn't worthwhile, then we can just debate that and show why it's not worthwhile. So in other words, in Velikovsky's case, you know, let him have his book and we can debate, you know, why it's not based on good evidence and so on. You know, don't try and suppress it maybe. But in the case of climate change, I think there's an interesting debate to be had. So there are climate change deniers out there, and I think they would like to draw on certain passages in this book and say, that's what I think is happening to me. I'm being suppressed, I'm being silenced. And And so they might hold up this book. This is the challenge to Sean that I may be putting forward. You know, the climate change denier holds up this book and says, exactly, this is the problem. The consensus on climate change is tyrannical. It's you know, it's dictatorial, and it's dangerous. There was an interesting session at in the GSA conference in America, the Geological Society of America. They have this session called Unconventional Ideas and Outrageous Hypotheses. And the reason they have this session is because they're bearing in mind the continental drift debate, and how there was a lot of resistance to continental drift, but ultimately it won through. And with worries about the history of the earth sciences, and especially that debate, they want to have a platform at their conference for unconventional ideas and outrageous hypotheses. So what they're trying to do there is say, even unconventional ideas can have a platform at our conference. Let's not silence people. The interesting thing about it is that a climate change denier submitted an abstract to this session, and they blocked it. They thought that was a step too far, because I mean, I haven't seen the abstract myself. I just knew one of the organizers of this session, and so I can't say for sure whether it was a poor quality abstract, but let's suppose it was a decent quality abstract as far as abstracts go, but they blocked it on the grounds that we know that climate change is happening, global warming is happening, therefore there can be no reason to give this person a platform. They're going contrary to absolutely solid scientific knowledge. Then the organizers thought it reasonable to actually block this, to actually suppress this idea. And the question I'm asking is whether that was in fact reasonable. And it's, yeah, there's different sort of strengths that I think you can put this on this. I mean, there's a variety of different views along a spectrum. You can have the Feyerabend view, where you want to say, look, every person deserves to have their say. There should be no silencing at all. And then you've got people like maybe Philip Kitcher here, who I think I tend to side with a little bit more than Sean in certain passages, or maybe they can be reconciled though, who I think would say that sometimes we do have absolutely solid scientific knowledge such that it's not helpful, maybe even occasionally harmful, to allow people to have a platform where they put forward strongly views that are in opposition to that knowledge. Of course, anyone can have a platform on social media. So the question is whether they're given a platform at a prominent academic conference like the GSA. And obviously the organizers of that conference decided that climate change denier didn't deserve a platform at that conference. Or whether they can get anything published in a reputable scientific journal, or whether all these sort of reputable scientific journals are just flatly refusing access to somebody with those quote unquote revolutionary ideas. So I do agree with Sean that many of these dynamics he talks about are absolutely real in scientific communities. There can be problematic inhibition. Maybe you wanted to think of suppression as a step further, but inhibition is where it just becomes difficult for that scientist to make progress because they hold an unorthodox idea, maybe not impossible. I think we can learn from some of these historical case studies, just as Sean says. I think that's a really valuable source of lessons about what can go wrong sometimes. And the continental drift case is an important lesson, where there was, in that case, clear inhibition of what ended up being what we would now call a true idea, that the continents do drift. but you can allow that this is a problematic dynamic of scientific communities sometimes, whilst also leaving room for space that sometimes there are established scientific facts that really shouldn't be challenged or can't reasonably be challenged in a professional environment, even if, of course, many scientific facts get challenged all the time in other contexts. So I'll leave it there for now. We'll just raise those questions and yeah.
Thank you, Peter. In cultural studies, this is known as a subversive reading of the text, which opens up different ways of making sense and different outcomes that might be read into the argument by different constituencies. I think it's important. I love that idea of outrageous science. I think I have come across that previously, and I wasn't quite sure how to respond to it, but now I do. Thank you for the guidance there. Okay, so the third discussant then is Ron Burnett, who is Emeritus Professor of Higher Education, University College London, and with Soren Bengtsting, who is unable to be with us today, co-editor of the Springer series, Debating Higher Education, Philosophical Perspectives, within which series Sean's book sits. And Ron is also the president of the Philosophy and Theory of Higher Education Society. So over to you, Ron.
Well, thank you very much, and hello, everybody. It's a great delight to be here and to say hello to Sean. I think, Sean, this is the first time we've seen each other, as it were, in the flesh. So after all these years, it's a great delight to be able to say hello to you more directly. In my few minutes, I just want to bang the drum for Sean's book as such, and to try to encourage you by one means or another to get hold of it or to see it in the one, if you can. Perhaps you can get your library to get hold of it and put it in their racks, indeed, if libraries still have books these days. This is the book, The Incentivized University, Scientific Revolutions, Policies, Consequences. And as you've just heard, it sits within the Springer series, which I have the honour to be co-editor of, Debating Higher Education, Philosophical Perspectives. And as I say, it's a great delight to see it actually in print and to have worked with Sean and to see Sean's efforts in bringing it to fruition. Well, why did we publish it? Well, I'll give you a few pointers as to why we publish it and why, if I can say so, I thought so highly of it as it was in gestation and as Sean was bringing it to fruition. First of all, the title. I think the title is absolutely splendid. The title, I find, is intriguing and is gripping, and it would make me want to see what's on the inside of the book, what's in the covers. The Incentivized University. There's a lot in the title. Scientific Revolutions, Policies and Consequences. Goodness me, what isn't there? So that is, I'm a great believer in titles, and that's a first turn on for me. But then you open it and you see the contents page. The contents page, I should say, is contents pages plural. Sean gives us lots of goodies in spelling out the subtitles of the sections of each chapter, and you'll see at a glance just what a rich cornucopia Sean gives us in the book. It's an extraordinary array of issues that Sean gives us, and I'll touch on that in a moment, but I just invite you to open just the contents page alone. I'm a great believer in a table of contents. How informative is it? How helpful is it? How much of a turn on is it? There is a great deal in it, as you'll see when you see it for yourself. But thirdly, Sean offers us an argument, and I won't try and repeat what Sean has said, but for me, there is an argument here about certainly the distortions, and even if I can push it a bit further, the corruption that comes into the scientific process as a result of the various incentives. I think that's a gentle word, a generous word that Sean uses, which are steering the scientific process. So there's a definite argument that flows through the whole book, and that's very important to us in selecting books for our series. But as Sean himself says, it's not just, as it were, a catalogue of the terrors and ghastliness that there might be to be found in this setting of the scientific process. But there is also, at the end, lurking through the book, a sense of the possibilities of ways of mitigating the difficulties that Sean identifies. And that is also a very appealing part of the book for us, that Sean turns to practical ways in the end of addressing the difficulties that he has identified. But I want also to say that the book is very enjoyable read. Can you believe that? A book in the philosophy of science. I mean, Sean mentions Kuhn and Feyerabend, and he's very much, if I can say so, in their tradition, in this sense, that Sean has produced a very readable book. How about that? And one almost wants to turn the pages and see what's on the next page. It is a delight to read, and one can't, if I can say so, if I can tread on a few toes here, doubtless, one can't always say that of books in our neck of the woods, perhaps even in the philosophy of science. It's a very lively book. It's a sprightly book. I love the way Sean actually writes, the actual feel of the text on the page. It's very engaging somehow. And moreover, Sean doesn't just hide behind the literatures that he surveys, which are very extensive, but we know where Sean stands on every issue that he identifies. And that takes great courage to be clear and to be able to state and come out with a position. So he tells us what Popper said, he tells us what Kuhn said in a very nice way. And then he comes out with his own position as well. And we know, as I say, exactly where he stands. But it is, as you'll have sensed also, and this is another important characteristic for this series, from the way I'm talking and from what you've already heard, this is a rigorous book. It's rooted in not just rooted in the literature, but rooted in a very careful and painstaking analysis of the literature. And I should say literature's plural. So you get a lot, if I could say so, of course, these days with a hardback from a major publisher, it's a very expensive book, but you get a lot for your money, if I can say so, if I can put it that way. There is a tremendous package here, but I just wanted to say, if I have 2 or 3 more minutes left, just to give you an indication of the extraordinary range of this book. First of all, it has an intellectual range. So within the covers of this book, we encounter, for those of you not altogether familiar with all of these dimensions and subdisciplines, we've got the philosophy of science, we've got knowledge policy, we've got sociology of science, we've got matters of epistemology and truth, we've got higher education and issues about the university in the contemporary age. And you've got lots of stuff on the economics of higher education, as well as the discipline of economics in higher education. And those are slightly different things. And then you've got all the matters about rankings and audit and evaluation and so on and so forth. So there's a huge range of, as it were, disciplines and subdisciplines coming into view. It's a multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary study, but it's also a transdisciplinary study, by which I mean that Sean identifies some big issues that are lurking out there in the world, and he brings them all into play, like a masterly artist, a great palette of colours, and they're all coming into play. So we've got all sorts of issues about science in the university. What's it feel like? How is it practiced? What are the incentive systems and what are the disincentive systems? What are the ideals of science? And how are they structured or not structured? And so on and so forth. Issues about scientific progress, about pseudoscience, as we've heard. Issues about the community, about the ways communities work or fail to work in the scientific world, and so on and so forth. And I very much warm, as we've just heard, very much warm to the section towards the end on decolonization. Huge global debates going on about that, and how the university might be responding to all of that, and more delicate and technical issue about replication, for example, which is finding its way into the scholarly magazines and journals. So there's a whole welter of issues, and they're all brilliantly, if I can, without embarrassing Sian, they're all brilliantly brought together, and still we get a definite sense of a story coming through, and the whole debate and narrative being worked through in a coherent way. So I want to take my hat off to Sian for an absolutely brilliant book. It's absolutely, if I can say, Sian, a model of the kind of book we're looking for in this series. And I hope nothing I've said to any of you will put any of you off from coming to us, to myself and my co-editor colleague, Sian Soren Bengtsson, with your own ideas for books in this series. We very much hope that we might have some thoughts and ideas from some of you about your own ideas, which we can take up and run with you. So thanks, Sian, very much for an absolutely brilliant book, and I hope it does very well for you. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Ron. We're exactly on time, which is interesting. Obviously, bureaucratization does have some benefits in that we're able to get through the program efficiently and without delay. For me, I think that apart from the lucidity of the text is also the fact that the chapters are quite short. And as you pointed out, Ron, I get to the end of the chapter and I'm looking for more, but I have to go to the next one, which is exactly, I guess, the way that we should all be writing, to encourage our students, especially, to read and to want to read more rather than having to get through the text, because that's what's required by the professor. So I think that the points that you make about style and expression and lucidity are spot on also. Okay, so now let me hand over to Sian, who has, I think, about 10 minutes to respond, and then we can open up the discussion to the wider delegates.
Great, thanks, Kian. And thanks so much to Nomalanga, Peter and Ron for your very generous, for your time and for your comments, critical and complimentary. Thanks so much, Ron. I should also say that some of the readability, or a good amount of the readability of the book and things like short chapters owe something to Ron, because Ron gave some great advice throughout the process. And I should really say that, if it weren't for Ron's encouragement when I emailed him with this idea at the very beginning, I'm not sure this book would have been written. So there's much about the book that that Ron can take some credit for. So and thanks so much for those words, Ron. It's just really great to have such accomplished and well-informed readers who read the book and understand what I'm trying to do with it. I think there's really no greater compliment than that. So thanks to all of you. I would also like to say that I kind of some people who are in the session now and maybe who view it later might be a bit puzzled by the contrast between, for example, Nomalanga's contribution and Peter's contribution. They're very different. But for me, it's great because they really illustrate the range that Ron's talking about, the range of issues that the book is trying to deal with. And it actually does connect these issues. Nomalanga was talking about a colleague in the broad sense here in South Africa, Dean, who was assassinated because he essentially rumbled a fraudulent scheme at a South African university that was based around the incentives that the university had created. I try to deal with the issues of how some of these dynamics play out in, say, global South institutions and less prestigious institutions in a delicate way in the book, because I'm aware of how those institutions are positioned within the broader academy. So I didn't make a direct reference, for example, to the Kamwenda experience, but it is an extreme version of the consequences of some of these things. And of course, we have at the other end, one has the more abstract and intellectual consequences, which Peter was talking about, which of course nevertheless have real world implications. Starting maybe with, I only have a maximum of 10 minutes, so bear that in mind. I'm very sympathetic to Nomalanga's views on a lot of these things, and of course she's in many ways also more informed about some of the dynamics in South African higher education, given her positioning formally and otherwise. I would say about decolonization is a very interesting one, because actually I've been doing a bit of work on decolonization myself recently, as a white male South African nevertheless. And I touch on some issues related to decolonization in the book. And on the one hand, I share the concern about the way in which decolonization has been co-opted. As Nomalanga sort of says, the animal is kind of, it's been co-opted in such a way that it fits back within the structures that it's supposed to be critiquing. But at the same time, I think it is a very important issue. And my position is that I don't think one should move away from it just because maybe it's been co-opted into these processes. I think that's maybe all I would say on that for now. But just to also locate, what Nomalanga is saying in the context of the book, I think, I can't remember, sometimes forget the chapter numbers. It might be around chapter 12. But I do have some discussion also. Ron touched on many of the issues that I raised in the book. One of the issues I also talk about is indigenous knowledge systems. And a little bit of a critique of both sides of that kind of debate, but essentially again thinking about how some of these questions interact with issues around indigenous knowledge systems, decolonization, hierarchies of knowledge, and so forth. And I take what I would call maybe something of an intermediate position on some of those issues to get to, and that actually links to Peter's challenge. So Peter's challenge was, and on the face of it, it's disconcerting that sort of climate change denialists might pick up the book and say, given the Feyerabend'ian sort of emphasis, this is exactly, it sort of describes what it is that they believe they're experiencing. I mean, Feyerabend, of course, was the first one to really put that forward, and I'm sort of riffing off that in a sense, and I do say that explicitly in the book. I think the one thing to say for those, and there's more of a recognition of this in the philosophy of science literature now, that Feyerabend didn't necessarily believe actually quite what he was saying. It was a provocation. He didn't really believe that any statement should be treated as equal to any other statement. So a disagreement with the weight of scientific evidence should be treated in the same way as somebody who bases their position on that scientific evidence. And so because the approach that I use is a truth approximating one, and that's not uncontroversial in the philosophy of science literature, and Peter knows this better than I do, and he talks about it in his forthcoming book, which I would very much recommend you read, by the way, about future-proof science. So even though we don't quite agree on some of these issues, but I think in some ways they're really useful contrasts between our approaches. I would say that I don't think the book should provide much succor for climate change denialists, because what it's arguing for, first of all, is greater tolerance, but not to the point of, and I say that I think somewhere in the book, I forget where, but not to the point of a fully anarchic approach. And it's about, again, the norms, so I do spend a lot of time on normal science, because my view is that the characterization that Kuhn used was one in which baseless suppression was a characteristic. So it's not suppressing an idea because it's wrong on its merits. It's suppressing an idea because it threatens the paradigm. It threatens the dominant players. It threatens even the psyche of an individual academic, or perhaps some of their pecuniary incentives. So in many ways, the concerns with normal science are that they resist revolutionary ideas for the wrong reasons. Right, so it's not to say that revolutionary ideas should always, and of course, the definition of revolutionary idea is also somewhat tautologist. So if you use the notion of a revolutionary idea in the Kuhnian context, it's actually correct. I don't know if Kuhn actually talks about incorrect revolutionary ideas. So in this sense, I mean, I think there's actually a lot more of it, and Peter knows this because we've spoken about it. I think in many ways our positions are comparable. I'm certainly not looking to endorse, as I say, a fully anarchic approach. And as I say at the end of the book, the concern is that the norms, essentially, especially if we move a little, if we limit ourselves to areas of inquiry that could be called scientific, and we accept that the objective of those areas of inquiry is truth approximation, then it's important that the individuals involved in that practice, the communities involved, and the institutions involved in the higher education systems conduct themselves in such a way that is conducive to that and prioritizes that, and is not based on power, for example. It's not based on path dependency, whether intellectually or in terms of the presence of particular types of individuals and so forth. So in some sense, it's not actually a very radical. I don't see it as an inherently radical position, but it is in some sense radical relative to what we currently have. And so I suppose that's the short answer I would give to Peter's challenge. I think the issue about the book on the solar system, as you say, Peter, the thing is that nowadays somebody could publish it in any way, right? So the publication is no longer limited by these societies and so forth. And I think very few people, at least who sort of believe in various kinds of democracy, would want to say that people should simply be prevented from publishing anything that disagrees with prevailing scientific consensus. The question about platforms and so on is a little bit more complicated. I talk about issues of peer review and such later on. But again, to emphasize the sort of broader point I just made, I would say that, I talk about the merits of sort of single blind review in economics, which I think the consequences of which have been devastating, I think, but entirely unrecognized, because it's essentially the power brokers in economics who've made that decision and who assess whether it's working or not, versus something like triple blind. And so, I make arguments for triple blind, and the arguments there are really just to have manuscripts assessed on their intellectual merit, even within the context of paradigms, rather than other factors like prestige hierarchies or demographic biases and these kinds of things. So again, notionally not a very radical thing, but in marked contrast to what's happening in some of our academic disciplines. Just to go back also to Nomalanga's example, I mean, I thought that was a really, Nomalanga, as you say, my institution, so UJ or indeed any other South institution, would be very happy that I published this book. Before this book, actually, I published a paper called Academics as Rent Seekers. And I won't go into the details, but I do recall a sort of academic bureaucrat being quite happy with that paper, and I felt, because I'd produced a credit, but I didn't feel like I didn't know if they'd even read the title, never mind the abstract of the paper, because I felt if they had, they really wouldn't have been so happy about it. But they were quite happy that I was meeting my targets and so forth. So it's very true. And I think that's something to be very careful of, because there is the danger that one just gets into the habit of producing these things for the sake of it, regardless of whatever one's original motives may have been, and essentially just becoming a part of a problematic system. At the same time, what I would also say is the nice thing about it, and this is the positive spin on what you're saying, is that, and I think Ron actually at some point maybe prompted me to say a little bit more about this in the book, and I didn't, but that also, to some extent, the positive side is that one can write critique and one can still be recognized for writing critique, even if it's for the wrong reasons. Okay, so that's the positive side of it, of course. So the institution is just happy that you're meeting your publication targets or exceeding them or whatever. They don't pay a lot of attention to the detail. That's bad in the context of a pseudoscience, and Nomalanga gave a brief discussion of pseudo theories, and which matches very well an example that I talk about. I create this quantum physiotherapy hypothetical example in the book, and I talk about how a field like quantum physiotherapy, which might be completely scientifically baseless in a pseudoscience, could perhaps exist quite happily in the modern academy, because people could churn out publications, they could have international conferences and so on and so forth. And this talks a little bit to Peter's concern. But I argue that the incentive system would exacerbate that kind of problem. It's definitely not going to solve it. Yeah, so let me just stop there. I was trying not to be too embarrassed by Ron's compliments, but thanks very much. I really appreciate those. And I think Kian, if you want to take over, thank you.
Yes, thank you. It was your article on academics as rent seekers that I think brought us together about 5 years ago at UJ, because I was looking for a framework in which to try to understand the publication practices that Nomalanga talked about, where you publish for rewards, financial rewards that are brought into the university, rather than to change the discipline, to fix the world, or to undertake some other kind of public purpose. And that gave me a framework. But as you point out, the bureaucrats simply tick the box. They look at publication in terms of balance sheets, and they're not really looking at the significance or the quality of the work that's coming through. And I think that's what this book could help us actually, in terms of reorienting university administrations, if we can get them to read also, but also to take on board some of these discussions. So let me then open up to the floor. I see we do have some fairly senior educational planners and researchers with us, including publication researchers. So hopefully you guys might ask some questions as well. So, okay, so I'm not sure that I'm seeing anybody's hands. My frame doesn't seem to allow that. So, yeah, Johan, yes, there you go. Right, you're in the picture. Johan, are you muted? You're muted, Johan.
That would be a first. Can you hear him? Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now.
Usually it's my wife that mutes me, but thanks, Kian, for the opportunity. I think it's mostly two comments. And first of all, let me just say, I literally heard of this publication through an email from Kian, I think yesterday or this morning. So I've unfortunately not had time to read the book. And it's always dangerous to comment on any book that you haven't read, although a lot of people sometimes seem to do that. But I do want to make two comments, and maybe the second one might be more useful than the first. I do look forward to reading the book, and for perhaps two very different reasons. One is slightly autobiographical. Some of you who may know me may even recall that I started my life as a philosopher of science 45 years ago, when I was exposed to the works of Kuhn and Lakatos and Popper in 1976 in philosophy of science honors. And that opened the world which I eventually would leave. And over the years, my life took various turns away from philosophy into science management, and in the last 25 years at Crest at Stellenbosch, into science policy, and more recently into scientometrics and bibliometrics. So from a purely personal point of view, I'm very intrigued by the titles in the table of contents. As Ronald says, one can learn quite a lot about the storyline of a book by looking at the table of contents, because in some point in my earlier career, I did call myself an unashamed realist in the tradition of Ernan McMullen and people like that. And then I started reading the sociology of science and everything about the science wars, taking on Robert Merton. So I'm really intrigued. And that's just a comment to say I'm looking forward to reading the book, because I want to see how Sean make the connections between philosophy of science, epistemological debates about truth or truthfulness, and bring that down to issues about managerialism and incentives in our higher education system, because I wouldn't have thought that they are obvious connections. So that is just a first point to make, that I look forward to reading this book as soon as possible. The second one is to say that when discussions about incentives arise in the South African context, I sometimes find myself to be in a paradoxical situation, and Kian would know this. On the one hand, I couldn't agree more with critics of incentive schemes that lead to perverse consequences. And again, you know, we've published on this, as some of you know, about predatory publishing in South Africa. We've produced big reports for the Academy of Science and Department of Education, pointing to the fact that different systems in this country have clearly led to perverse publication behavior. In some of the cases, you could even say fraudulent. It's not even a question of being questionable in a moral sense. It's simply fraudulent when an academic submits 120 articles for subsidy per year. And I'm not talking about an hypothetical case, because we do have access to that data. And so we know that there's now a significant proportion of academics in this country who simply chase the money. And it's because it's allowed by the system and by their institutions. And we have to remind ourselves that there's something very unique about the South African higher education system. We're the only system in the world where we both pay people fairly directly for publishing, although it goes through university offices, and then rate them through the NRF system. There's no country in the world that does this in this one-on-one relationship. So these two are, of course, mutually reinforcing. So because, you know, I've sat on appointments and promotions committees where the chair says, let's just look at the H-index values of the people, the journal impact factors in which they publish, or whether they've got an A, B, C, or, you know, Y rating from the NRF. Now, that's the worst case of abuse of research metrics. So you could ask, you know, we continue to publish about bibliometrics. Why would you do that? And one of the reasons is that there is a movement within the field of research evaluation, which started with the DORA Declaration, the Leiden Manifesto, which says that we really have to promote, you know, acceptable and ethical use of research metrics. But why is it paradoxical? Because let me just make one last point. The annual budget of the Department of Higher Education and Training under its subsidy framework last year was 5.2 billion rand. That's billion with a B, Betty. And that is what was paid out to university academics for publishing, producing master graduates and PhDs. The total budget of our National Research Foundation last year to pay out research grants was barely over $1 billion, and another $1 billion for scholarships. Now, you see, this is where I sometimes feel slightly, you know, you have to say, you know, do you kill the subsidy system or do you try and fix it in a way that can be fixed? I think Sean suggested that some of the things that are wrong in the system can be fixed. I certainly believe that. Kian knows that we're advocating for ways to get rid of the, you know, the fraudulent and gaming behavior of scientists. Do you kill the subsidy system? And that money, then I'll tell you where it will go. It will go to NSFAS, because all unspent monies in the Department of Higher Education and Training in the country at the moment automatically gets channeled through to the NSFAS, that's the student funding system, which is undergraduate support. And the NRF funding being cut by 25% by Treasury last year. And is that not more harmful? So my point is we are currently in a situation in South Africa, both nationally as far as science and education is concerned, where our R&D expenditure has gone down as a percentage of GDP, while expenditure on research from research granting agencies have gone down. And then you have the biggest funder, ironically, of the DHET is through the publication subsidy system. And so it's a quandary where I said, well, I think with higher education institutions, young academics, especially young Black and women academics, they need incentives. They need to feel that they are rewarded when they publish, but it has to be in an ethically defensible manner. And that's why I feel sometimes we're in this interesting conundrum where you say, okay, we can't kill the incentive system. Can we try and rehabilitate it or in some way make it more ethical? Thank you for the time, Kian.
Well, thank you. Johan, you came in exactly on cue. And I think again, like Nomalanga have grounded the debate within the South African political economic context and identified the negative outcomes, but I know that you also very often laud the positive outcomes of the incentive schemes, but then also the contradictions that exist between different arms of government and different ministries and different agencies within the research sector, which are sometimes working against each other rather than actually enabling the researcher on the ground who's, as you say, stuck with a variety of performance management operations from university to DHET to National Research Foundation and beyond, which consumes enormous amounts of time, energy, and resources before one actually gets to a measurable output. So I think the points you make are very good. So I'm going to ask Sean perhaps to respond. I know we've had these discussions, he and I have had these discussions over the last 5 or 6 years. And I think his book is implicitly addressing many of these questions anyway. Sean?
Yeah, thanks very much, Kian. And thanks, Johan, for those 2 comments or questions. I look forward to your thoughts on the book. I didn't realize you actually had a philosophy of science background, so particularly looking forward to that. And just to say one thing that I didn't say in my introduction that I did intend to emphasize was that one of the things about the book that does seem to be somewhat unusual is the bringing together of a fairly straightforward scientific realist point of view with the kind of sociology of science literature, some of the insights from that, whereas typically there was this sort of division, as it were, with the sociology of science literature, sociology of scientific knowledge literature, tending to be more associated with non-realist or anti-realist positions. And it's essentially, I don't go into this in a lot of detail in the book, but essentially I'm taking the position that there need not be that contrast. These are not positions that cannot coexist. So one can actually have a scientific realist position and draw substantially on the SSK type literature and those kinds of insights and bring them together. So that is what the book tries to do and hopefully does so successfully. On your second point, in other parts of my career, I've worked on public policy and public finance. And in fact, right now I'm working with some colleagues on doing some work related to higher education funding. So I do have quite a lot of thoughts on the South African system and what could be done. And to some degree, I need to write those up separately. But what I would say is that, again, it comes back to this issue of the dynamics of institutions. So in brief, what I think needs to happen, or should I say needed to happen, in the post-apartheid era in South Africa, was a focus on institution building. And instead of that, what's been put in is this incentive system, which very crudely tries to drive academics and academic systems in these desirable directions. So increasing student throughput, Nomalanga referred to this earlier, and this is actually something we're doing some empirical quasi-econometric work on now, and publication output. Instead of investing in the much more difficult, and I think in a country like South Africa, it is much more difficult than maybe some other countries that have more established higher quality higher education systems, where you actually need to be, in South Africa, you need to be rebuilding institutions to some degree from the bottom up. And that's not a pleasant task. It's a very difficult task. There's a lot of politics involved, difficult politics with a small p and a big P. And so basically my view is that nettle has not been grasped, and instead the incentive system has been relied on. The incentive system has failed in many ways, I think. And so, but I would also say on the public finance side, I don't think it's a necessary consequence. It could happen, as you suggest. If you scrap the incentive system, the money will go from the higher education system. But the way the block grant system works, there's actually no reason why that incentive money couldn't just be distributed across other parts of the block grant system, or it could just be, it could be allocated in other ways. So it's a little bit, in some of my very early writing on South African higher education policy, I did suggest that we might need to think about scrapping it, although I said, first of all, we should try improving the system. I'm not going to commit to my position now, but what I would say is the focus needs to be on institution building, and this issue that that both you alluded to, Kian and Nomalanga, which is that you can't, using just publication metrics as a way of determining who you should appoint as an academic, whether you should promote them or not, and so forth, isn't really adequate. One has to find a way of thinking about quality, intellectual quality, in a more substantive sense, and the incentive system doesn't really get at that.
Right, thank you, Sean. Okay, there were two chats, one from Tiffany. Tiffany, would you like to place your lengthy comment into a single sentence question?
Yeah, so sorry for the long. I just didn't know we'd get to it. Thank you. This has been really great. It's just great to hear your thoughts on the book, because I have read some of it and I'm really enjoying it. But I was also just thinking about larger incentive structures around the globe, just world knowledge systems, that what we know about core and periphery locations of different countries and the incentives that they are attached to within that larger structure. You know, global north versus global south in some ways, and thinking, you know, is there something to be done at that level? And you just answered the question to some extent in what you just mentioned about reconstituting institutions from the ground up. It seems to be is the answer, and that sense they would possibly de-link from those larger systems. But anyway, I just wonder if you had any thoughts on that.
Great, thanks. Kian, can I respond? Yeah.
Yes, please go ahead.
Great. Thanks for drawing attention to that. So one of the issues, it is some aspects of those concerns around these global dynamics, global north and global south, core periphery, etc., are addressed under the banner of this concern with the conduct of scientific communities and institutions. So my view is that the evidence is extremely strong that the manner in which intellectual contributions of various kinds are assessed is heavily distorted by prestige hierarchies. And that's prestige hierarchies within disciplines, within the global north, but also within the broader global context, so global north to global south. I think Nomalanga was also alluding to this in the context of the decolonization literature. And so by addressing problematic dynamics within institutions and within academic communities, that should at least mitigate some of the harms, right? And so one example, but it's a bit complicated. I discussed this a little bit in the chapter in economics, on economics and triple blind review and so forth, where on the one hand, my general position is to advocate triple blind review because, and it's really easy to do now with the technological systems we have, so to advocate triple blind review because it removes the possibility, or at least if it works, it removes the possibility, for example, of racial bias, gender bias, geographical bias, and so forth. And in principle should allow a manuscript to be assessed on its merits. So the question is, why isn't everybody doing triple blind? And my view is that is actually a question we should be asking. So triple blind should be a standard because it eliminates these kinds of, and just prestige discrimination and so forth. And then there should be a justification as to, okay, why do we want to adopt double blind instead of triple blind? I had an interesting discussion with a colleague from a country where there's a very small number of philosophers who speak the local languages in the global north. And so her argument was, as an editor, if she was triple blind, she'd almost certainly end up sending the paper to a collaborator of the author if you didn't know what the identities were. Okay, well, maybe that's an argument. Another argument, which I mentioned in the book, is from the journal Feminist Economics, where there's an argument that in order to actually assist authors from, say, the global south, it's important to know their identities. Now, I argue in the book that's plausible because it's consistent with the intellectual outlook and practice of that group of scholars, feminist economists. But it would not be plausible, for example, if mainstream neoclassical economists were to make that example. So just to say that in general, I think a lot of these harms they're exacerbated in the global context, so from core periphery. But what I also say in the book, which I know will make me unpopular with some people, but again, I'm kind of taking a middle ground here, is to suggest that and I mean some quite, I think, radical African scholars have also raised concerns about this, scholars of decoloniality. One must also avoid sort of shutting oneself off from the rest of the world. So I'm very much against that in the context of what one might call peripheral academic communities or global south academic communities. I think what we see, what we sometimes see in the global south, and I think this is also something that Nomalanga alluded to in her own way, is that one ends up with a certain kind of what's the right word, parochialism. And what one doesn't want is an intellectual parochialism. The extreme version of this is the is the fairly crude version of decolonization, which says, oh, we must just get rid of all knowledge that is deemed Western, always Western associated, and we'll just do our own thing in the global South. And that I don't endorse. So again, it's about finding a balance, avoiding parochialism, but recognizing that that a lot of these kinds of problematic dynamics are exacerbated for those at the periphery of these disciplines, or at the periphery of hierarchies of prestige in the global higher education system.
Right, I see that the chat room is really buzzing right now. And I think that the questions that have been asked have been answered by other members of the participants, which is good, that there's a subsidiary discussion going on in relation to the main one. Does anybody want to extemporize on those points or raise some new points? While you're giving some thought to that, Sean, as a co-editor of 2 international journals, the idea of triple peer review is seriously daunting, because prior to COVID, you might approach 2 or 3 people and get 1 response from a peer reviewer. Then it was 4, then it was 8, now it's 12. And then you get to 15 and 16, and maybe 1 will reply with a 1-sentence response. So there's a declining enthusiasm amongst peer reviewers to actually engage in this activity anymore, because of death, exhaustion, retirement, the contraction of the academic enterprise, but also particularly because universities do not acknowledge peer review as the fundamental engine of knowledge assessment and production. Perhaps you could respond to how could one address that particular conundrum.
All right, thanks, Ken. Yeah, I mean, I think I recall in some of our discussions, you raised, in some of your publications, you raised this concern quite strongly, I think, in the South African context, about the fact that, the South African, I mean, to try and summarize it myself, essentially the South African publication incentive system that we've just been talking about, and Johan was raising concerns about, is reliant on this unpaid labor of editors and reviewers and so forth. I mean, we know that's true internationally in many cases, but the extent of the problem is highlighted in the South African case, where there's so much reliance on the incentive system that's based on publications. And I very much share your concerns about that, and I find them very persuasive. With triple blind, at least in the way I envisage it, I'm not sure it would necessarily increase the problems in terms of getting reviewers. I mean, the idea is that neither and people may use these terms differently, but in double blind, the author does not know the reviewer's identities, and the reviewers do not know the author's identity or identities. In triple blind, the editor doesn't know the author's identity either. But that shouldn't necessarily create any problems. Again, there are always these sets of principles that reviewers are asked to adhere to, which would include declaring any conflict of interest. So if you happen to ask a reviewer to review a paper of somebody who they know or they've collaborated with, then one could, that should be ruled out, provided they abide by the systems. Of course, that could happen anyway under double-blind review, because as an editor, you just may not know that there are these relationships between the individuals. So I think in that sense, I think there are contexts in which triple-blind can be quite easily implemented, within the context of whatever problems one is already experiencing. I should say also that in for example, the case of economics, I'm talking about the so-called top journals in economics run by the American Economic Association, which is the one that brought in this move from double-blind to triple-blind. And you can read the elaboration of my argument on this in the book, but I say it's particularly absurd because the reason they did so was because they were concerned that their reviewers were Googling the contents of papers in order to identify the authors, and therefore double-blind was essentially redundant. And their response to this was to move to single-blind and do nothing else, in essence. So they didn't solve the problem, they accepted the problem and concretized it. But what's worse is that if they just stayed with the American Economic Association journals, that would have been fine. But because of their prestige and because essentially mainstream neoclassical economics is centered on the United States, what we've seen is this ripple effect where now other journals have adopted single blind, including a journal like Economics Letters, whose sole purpose is to publish short versions of papers before they actually get presented, before they get published as working papers and so forth. So there's no basis for adopting single blind there at all. But that's happened because of this this ripple effect of prestige. But I mentioned that example because I have no doubt that the American Economic Association journals would very easily be able to continue getting reviewers if they move to a triple blind system. But essentially my view is it's not in the interests of incumbents, because incumbents are more likely to have their papers rejected under a system like that, whereas outsiders are much more likely to have their papers accepted. I see there's a hand also, by the way, from Filippo.
Filippo, yeah. Carry on, Filippo. Are you there?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. I wanted to ask, so I myself have argued for sort of a physics archive model for publication that's sort of different from the triple blind peer review that Sean argues for, and I agree with most of the problems that he points out. So I'm sort of a fellow sort of diagnosis is right. I think the prognosis is problematic, I think, and just a couple of issues that the triple blind peer review system would, I think, fare worse on than the archive sort of outsourcing peer review type system that is in use in physics and other disciplines. So one is language of publication. Now I'm a philosopher, so I'm not a philosopher of science. And in philosophy, and I've worked on this recently as well, there's a big problem with non-native speakers of English publishing in what is now the de facto lingua franca of all academia, which includes also humanistic disciplines in which language is kind of more important and sort of easier to disregard publications or submissions rather in terms of just the language that one submits them in, right? So the triple blind peer review system, at least unless you have some correctives. So, for instance, stickers, policies like it's done in, for example, dyslexia or other conditions in the UK for students. That might be one way to correct the triple blind peer review system, but the physics archive doesn't have that to start with. And the other issue is sort of who checks how triple blind peer review is implemented, right? So again, my understanding of the way philosophy journals work, and I imagine scientific journals work as well, they're private enterprises to a large extent, right? So they can implement their policies in a discretionary way, and who knows what happens when someone submits a paper, who's checking that it's actually triple blind rather than not. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Filippo. Yeah, I was actually going to ask what discipline you came from. So, if you are a philosopher, even if you're not a philosopher of science, you might know that there have been some debates about this quite recently in some philosophy of science journals about the role of peer review. My general and there have been different arguments, right? So you're presenting one which I haven't heard emphasized, but I have heard related issues being raised. There are others. In most cases, what I tend to find is that, you were talking about the diagnosis and the prognosis. There's a turn of phrase that I use from Thandika Mkandewere about the pessimism of the diagnosis and the optimism of the prescription. And he was paraphrasing Gramsci. And that tends to be my view also of the move to the sort of phil-sci archive, the physics type archive approach. Because if you think about the language issue, so you're quite right, there's the potential for discrimination against authors based on the fluency of their English, for example. But it's not obvious to me that moving to the physics archive approach is necessarily going to resolve that. If one thinks of the question as being like, what do people read and what do people in positions of power within a discipline read, it's not obvious to me that they're going to be more likely to read an article that's written by a second or third language English speaker when it's put in an archive than when it's, you know, submitted to journals. What we do know is that if it gets through the journal system, it probably is going to be, at least more prestigious journals, it probably is going to be read. And so it's not at all clear that it actually resolves the problem. It just actually, it just prevents us seeing whether the problem is there or not. So the approach that I tend to favor, which again is quite consistent with the broad approach I outline in the book, is to focus on the norms and the rules. So as you say, so what I would say is if that is a concern, then there should be policies in place to deal with it. And I do think that should be the case, because after all, there's no reason to believe that the merit of an idea is going to depend on the language of the person who's come up with the idea. So it is important to find ways. Now, the problem that then arises, and this is maybe something that Kian would raise, is, well, you know, if you're a journal editor, how do you find the resources to deal with this? So that's a more practical question. Again, in the case of sort of the more prestigious journals in disciplines, they often have more resources than others. And so one would need to think about practical ways around it, but I just don't think that moving to these sort of notionally open approaches is actually going to work. My view, and so I did a presentation recently at the British Society for the Philosophy of Science conference about peer review. And the broad argument I made was that actually I think there are quite good reasons to believe that a lot of the things that people are worried about with formal and so-called traditional peer review could get a lot worse if we move to what seem like desirable open systems, because a lot of the dynamics that exist within peer review also exist in the broader world, but actually can exist in a more exacerbated way because they're essentially unregulated. So yeah, well, I'll leave my answer there, but yeah, that's sort of my position.
Thanks. While we're waiting for another hand, yeah, let me point out that many of these issues have been discussed at the Academy of Science annual workshops involving journal editors. There are over 320 South African journals registered, and about 100 to 200 editors might participate in different models of peer review have been put on the table, although the Academy itself is rather conservative in terms of its double-blind review recommendations. But I think these are points that we can put back on the ASAF agenda again, because I think they also break down differently in terms of discipline. So where you're working in anthropology, for example, very often the researcher has to locate him or herself in terms of position between the academy and the community, and within the community and within the academy, issues that are not always understood or appreciated by ethics committees. But we do have to keep a kind of flexibility to be able to respond to different research practices. Okay, I see that Piet Stryker has a hand. Please go ahead, Piet.
Yeah, so my question relates again to the contrast between Kitcher and Feyerabend, and you mentioned that you know, Kitcher would be more concerned with in paradigm progress, and Feyerabend perhaps more with progress outside the specific paradigms. And you gave several good examples of where, you know, a delayed revolution could cause harm. On the other hand, Kitcher was more concerned with what happens within a paradigm. Now, how do you balance those two concerns? Because, I mean, if you look at specific revolutions, it's quite obvious that a delay in that revolution would be harmful, but one could argue that revolutions in science are rare, and that most of the time people are practicing normal science. And so even though, you know, progress during normal science is not inhibited that much by dissent, one could say, you know, because that is 99% of what's happening, it is still a problem, which would be perhaps what Kitcher would argue. So how do you make a judgment between normal science, you know, the progress in normal science versus progress due to revolutions?
Thanks very much for the question. I should say, by the way, that Pete has read most, if not maybe all, of my books. So he's asking about something that I failed to mention earlier. So thanks for that. Which is, one of the things this concept that I emphasize in the book is this idea of what I call temporal opportunity cost, which was briefly alluded to, but not by name, by Peter. And what Peter's talking about is that. So essentially, this idea that by virtue of suppressing or denying a revolution, you incur substantive social costs. And that's what I use the cholera example for in the book, to basically say, well, actually, the right theory of cholera was there for about 50 to 70 years. And effectively, I mean, millions of people died because an incorrect theory was maintained. So these are not trivial things. And so in some sense, I use that argument against Kitcher, who sort of says, well, you know, I think even from his perspective, I think he recognizes he's quibbling a bit. By being concerned about the fact that, well, if you have dissenters within a scientific discipline, then that could slow progress from a normal science perspective. But of course, you know, when one contrasts that to potentially the massive costs of hindering or delaying a revolution, you know, even if you were to think about it from a crude utilitarian point of view, one might make a case in that way. But I think there's no, you know, the problem here in essence, for a kind of philosophical point of view, is we don't know what the truth is. So, you know, in Peter Vickers' book, which is forthcoming, he talks about future-proof science. And well, I'll just give him a brief a plug in that sense. You know, what Peter proposes is a 95% threshold. So if 95% of the designated scientific community agree in a particular position, say that climate change is caused by human beings, then we can say that that's probably a position that's going to hold up over time. That's essentially true. If 95% of a sufficiently diverse, so it's got various conditions, sufficiently diverse scientific community agree on that. I would nevertheless say, you know, I don't adopt even the Feyerabend'ian provocation of complete anarchy. So, and as I said earlier, you know, many of the propositions in the book shouldn't be radical at all, because essentially what they're arguing for is, please, can we ensure that these institutions and these communities adjudicate these arguments on their merits, rather than because of the prestige of who's making them or their geographic location and so forth. That shouldn't be a radical argument, but it kind of is relative to the empirical evidence of what's going on in these communities right now. So that's not saying that we should just allow any crank to have their arguments treated with the same authority as maybe people who might be considered established experts, but it does push towards but separately, I do push towards a greater, I don't like using the word tolerance, but a greater openness to dissenting positions. So as you say, I mean, I argue against Kitcher, and I think Kitcher's found, you know, what I also say in the book is that I think the foundations, and I'm not the first person to say this, but I think the foundations of Kitcher's work are a bit shaky, because essentially he uses economics type models to substantiate his arguments about the dynamics of scientific communities. And I think those models are quite suspect even in the context from which they come, so mainstream neoclassical economics. I think they're even more suspect in this particular context than what is, and then there's a debate going on, by the way, in the literature in meta-science around the use of formal models. A bunch of publications say in the last decade around that. So yeah, there's no unfortunately easy rule that we can adopt. It's sort of trying to assess whether the decisions that are being made are in terms of what ideas and what positions are justified are really based on their merits, as opposed to maybe the interests of the academics involved, the parochialism, or the dogmatism, and this is a term that Kuhn used, the dogmatism of the scientific community. So one of the debates that I had recently in presenting some of my more elaborated work on normal science was about whether, you know, whether dogmatism is an acceptable thing or not. You know, so Popper argues very strongly that dogmatism is essentially a terrible thing. Some people say he softened that up later on, but Kuhn had very clearly argued that, well, actually, you know, dogmatism is not so bad at all. And you know, I argue in the book that I think Kuhn very much understated the dangers of normal science, even though he characterized them quite well. So ultimately, those are kind of those are the broad considerations, and then you have to bring it down to a specific issue. And just to say, for those who don't know, I mean, Pete's been doing quite a bit of work on COVID, and essentially also on issues where maybe scientific consensus, but certain groups in the scientific community have been not so right on certain kinds of predictions about COVID, and other people who might not traditionally be listened to so much have been more correct. I think COVID's. I resisted. I say this in the introduction, well, the acknowledgement section of the book. I resisted any reference to COVID in the actual text of the book, as tempted as I was. But I do think it makes a nice case study for some of these arguments, because one of the things about COVID was that in many respects it was novel for the scientists involved. And those scientists didn't have a good enough sense of the limitations of the scientific knowledge they had. Some of my colleagues in philosophy referred to this notion of epistemic humility. They didn't have enough humility about the limitations of their models because they hadn't had to use them in a novel situation of that kind. And so they got a lot of things wrong. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't take science seriously or we shouldn't take those experts seriously. But once you get to the domain of making policy, which of course, affects, life and death, Nomalang was also talking about life and death, then I think these kinds of issues become even more pertinent, the limitations of scientific consensus. And it's not about, getting rid of science or embracing climate change denialism, for example, in terms of Peter's provocation earlier, but just about having a much more responsible sense of the strengths and limitations of our knowledge and the academic communities and scientific communities that generate that knowledge.
Thank you.
Thanks. We've got about 4 minutes left. I do know that two of the delegates are senior research associates, and there's been a bit of discussion led by Julie Grant on the rather precarious positioning of that status. And I'd like to invite her perhaps to offer some short observations on how this discussion might affect or might influence their discussions with universities about where they fit into the scheme of things. Julie, are you still with us?
Yeah, I'm here. I didn't want to derail the conversation too much, but so for quite a number of years, I've been a senior research associate at UJ without consistent employment. So I've actually relied on the subsidies as a way to subsidise my research, which I wouldn't have been able to do without these subsidies. In addition to that, while it is really good to have consistent employment, the inconsistency of employment also gave me the ability to go and undertake long-term research that a lot of people in sort of full-time or consistent employment can't do. So to a certain extent, I was able to, visit my research site much more often than would normally be available, and to spend longer time with my communities that I work with, giving me a really good understanding of what goes on there. So as I say, I wouldn't be able to do that if I had been sort of full-time employed, but without the subsidy, I couldn't have afforded to do that. So it was a really important, it is important for me to carry on my research in that way. But I do accept there are a lot of issues related to, how different people use the incentives. It's very strict at UG what you use it for, and sometimes I also would get frustrated. So, for example, I wasn't able to buy a laptop with my research funds, although for me, I feel that is a really important part of my research. So I had to go and find my own money to do that. But yeah, so just to say that there are good points to the subsidies, as I think everyone's recognising. They do certainly make it possible for some people to tap into funding. And also, just as another note, as a foreigner, there's a lot of funding opportunities in South Africa which I can't tap into because I'm a foreigner. And I'll leave it there because we're running out of time.
Thank you. Okay. All right. So, Sean, I'll give you the last 30 seconds.
Thanks very much. Well, let me just try and quickly respond to that. And as I say, this is something that I think towards the end of the book, Ron pressed me a bit on, but I decided not to go into detail on it. But in essence, I would say that, yes, at the margin, as it were, there are ways in which certain individuals can get these kinds of problematic systems to work for them. And I might be one of those individuals, by the way. But nevertheless, I don't think that that's necessarily a good case for the system itself. So overall, I think that the overall, in the South African case, for example, I do think the system has caused more harm than good. I know that there are exceptions to that. And I think to the extent that there have been such benefits, which in some ways, I mean, even what you're describing, Julie, is kind of a little bit unintended. It's not necessarily that these grants are these sort of incentives are intended to support people doing the kind of work you do, but fortunately you've managed to make it work, and I've also managed to make it work in certain kinds of ways. But the fundamental issue in the South African case is institution building, and I just don't think that the incentive system gets anywhere close to dealing with that, and in fact it does a lot of harm. So I think what we should hope for is this kind of system that allows you to do what you want to do, because it's almost certainly worthwhile. But it probably wouldn't look like the kind of system that we have now.
Thank you, Sean. Okay, so let me wrap up very briefly. Thanks to our discussants, Nomalonga McKees, Peter Vickers, and Ron Burnett, and to an active participation from those who came in online. And from my perspective, I really do think that this is the kind of book that our executives and managers at universities should be reading. And I'm wondering, Sean, whether you couldn't mimic our erstwhile principal who runs reading groups, I think it's once a month on different campuses, but let's put your book at the center of that particular reading list in order to turn the lens on ourselves. And so that our students and our staff and our support administrators can get a sense of where they fit into the system and how the system has shaped them, and not only shaped them, but shaped the way that they identify problems, solve problems, and sometimes avoid the problems. And maybe we can use your book as a positive outcome to what Bill Readings calls the ruined university. And start reconstructing those ruins through the perspectives and experiences of those who actually are the workers in that institution, the students and the academics in particular. So thank you to everybody for sticking it out and for participating. And I see that the webinar has been recorded. Sean, will the webinar perhaps be circulated, or can we approach you for a copy?
I think it will be posted online. Vanessa can just confirm, but I think it's been streamed on YouTube and that will stay up. Okay. And I think the Zoom recording may be available as well. So I think it will be online, and I'll share a link. I should also say thanks very much, Kian, for sharing. And also, if you want to promote the book to the higher education bureaucrats and managers, please do. I think you'll have more success in that than me. So. Okay.
All right. Thanks, Sean. All the best.
Thank you. Thanks so much, everyone.
Okay.
Thanks, Sean.
Bye.
Bye.
Cheers.